Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to this week's mega review where we talk about the absolutely iconic Alien. Yes, in space, no one can hear you scream. Unless you happen to be a Xenomorph, in which case they can. It's really difficult to overstate how much of an impact this movie had, not just to the horror movie genre, but to all movies. There's so many things about this movie that were groundbreaking. The tactile, gritty, real environments, the use of pacing, drawing out that tension for the climax, the fly-on-the-wall feel to many of the conversations, the special effects, the gore, the horror. Hell, this movie even did jump scares well. This movie put Ridley Scott on the map, and well deserved. It truly is a modern day masterpiece, and it's an absolute must view for anyone who wants to get into filmmaking. For some audiences looking at it now, we may have become somewhat desensitized to all this gore and horror nowadays, but this came out in 1979, and no one had ever seen anything quite like this before. This truly was horrifying for the people who saw it.
I mean, people were screaming and running out of the theatre.
From what I remember, Ridley and Ivor Powell were holding down Alan Ladd Jr., who was trying to get out of the cinema.
The usher had fainted when the robot's head came off.
We had the management saying, you know, this is terrible. All the people are being sick everywhere and it's in a state. And we thought, this is great.
People were genuinely afraid watching this movie.
They had the space jockey in front.
I understand somebody tried to set fire to it or something, as they thought it was the work of the devil. Great.
And for people watching it again today for the first time, they still feel that fear, although younger viewers who want to go and watch this should be aware that this was at a different time, when science fiction was notoriously slow-paced. There's certain sections in this which by today's standard lasts a long time, and you might even find yourself getting bored at certain points, so just be prepared for that if you're going to watch this for the first time. And Alien, amazingly, is another one of those movies that we could put on the list of movies that probably wouldn't have gotten made if it wasn't for Star Wars.
They wanted to follow through on Star Wars, and they wanted to follow through fast, and the only spaceship script they had sitting on their desk was Alien. So they greenlighted it. Wham.
Who would have thought that Star Wars had a hand in creating Alien? Bizarre. There's something very visceral about the Xenomorph. It's difficult to really put into words, but a lot of people feel that this strikes at something disturbing deep inside each of us. And to call the Xenomorph a creature of our nightmares is not just some kind of metaphor. There's actually more truth to it than you might know.
Where this artist named Hans Rudy Giger was staying while his show was on display in Paris. Giger brings out this little tinfoil. He said, "Would you like some opium?" I said, "Why do you take that?" He said, "I am afraid of my visions." He said, "It's only your mind." He said, "That is what I'm afraid of."
But Fox hated Giger's work because they said, people stay away in droves. This is so ghastly. It's too much. It's too much. It's repulsive. And we said, no, it's done so beautifully. It all depends on the way the director utilizes it.
H.R. Giger was clearly a bizarre character.
He was so strange. Most people kept him the creeps. They wanted his office way across the room than the other because he was like Dracula. He was Peter Lorre or something. He was always dressed in black and he had very soft voice. But there was always these horrible stories. We heard that he had the skeleton from his fiancée who had committed suicide, and people gave him the creeps. I got along with him great. Dan and I and Ridley got along superbly. Everyone else sort of thought he was so weird.
Combine that with the weirdness that Ridley Scott also has, and you've got some weird, twisted stuff. A number of people have mentioned that there's an underlying theme towards this movie Alien, that the Xenomorph in some way represents the dark, evil part of human nature, that it's somehow a manifestation of just our raw survival urges, our violent natures, and just that basic biological urge to perpetuate the cycle of life.
I admire its purity, survival, unclouded like conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality.
Perhaps Giger was tapping into those same things when he dreamed up these images.
The light hurts me. If you have too much sun, you like then to be in the shadow, and I like always to be in the shadow, in the dark.
But beneath all that scary exterior was an actor called Bolaji Badego, weird name. And he was chosen for the role because he was 7 feet tall, but he was extremely skinny, so he could fit into the suit quite easily.
One of the casting directors had been standing in a pub and had stared at this guy who looked like probably close to 7 feet, right? And very slender, very thin, kind of elegant. And his name was Balaji. So the guy had gone over to him in the pub and said, they all lined, how would you like to be in movies?
It really kind of blows my mind that he got the job just because he happened to be in the bar at that particular moment. If he had decided to go to some other bar or just stay home, things would have been very different in his life. But we all know that every xenomorph starts its life as a cute little chest burster. And a very widely spread rumor out there is that all the actors didn't know that this chest bursting scene was about to happen. That's a half truth. Obviously all the actors knew it was going to happen because they read the script. But what they didn't know was that John Hurt's chest was rigged with like air hoses and blood spurts to like shoot out and go in all directions when the chest burster was set to come out.
When that thing burst out of there and they shot me with an entire blood pellet. It was like a jet of blood that hit I was so taken aback. My knees hit the back of the banquette and I flipped upside down and I had 2 cowboy boots sticking up. I turn over, I realize they're still shooting. I have to get up and I continue acting.
Personally, I always found the facehugger itself to be kind of more disturbing. I mean, the xenomorph's scary, but it's still kind of humanoid form. This thing just creeps me out in so many ways. A huge amount of time was spent on the design of the facehugger itself, and it went through a number of different variations. They eventually settled on the idea of this giant claw-like hand that wraps itself around your head. The underside of it that we see Ash working on was actually a whole bunch of oyster guts and fish parts, all sort of thrown in together. Knowing how iconic the facehuggers now are, it's pretty disturbing to know that things could have gone very differently had we gotten different designers.
He asked Aldrich how he would handle the face-hugging creature. Aldrich said, "Oh, no problem. I'll just go to the market and get a liver and throw it on the guy's face." Gordon didn't want to hear that.
And when it comes to the xenomorph, a huge chunk of this alien's life cycle is laid out in this movie. From egg to facehugger to chest burster to xenomorph. But it doesn't complete that circle in the theatrical cut. We don't get to know about the Queen alien until the second movie. However, I know a lot of people are going to mention it. Yes, there is a scene that was cut from the end movie that does show Dallas cocooned on the wall, and he's being kind of siphoned off, drained off to form another egg. We see Brett, who is captured earlier in the movie, is further along in this egg transformation. And that they are being turned into eggs is later confirmed in the novelization, where he and Ripley have a bit more of a conversation before he gets mercy killed by her. She asks, "What has it done to you?" and he looks to the egg and says, "That used to be Brett." So obviously the same thing's going to happen to him. This was cut out of the movie because at that time in the story, Ripley only had about 3 minutes left to get back to the shuttle, and this scene goes for 4 minutes long. Had this scene been included, it would have rounded out the life cycle of the alien. But as we all know, it left that gap open for the Queen to be introduced in the second movie. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Queen has now removed this from canon.
In the novelization of Alien 3, Ripley herself elaborates on this theory when speaking to Dylan about the alien queen growing inside her. She explains, "The one that got loose on my ship, the Nostromo, was making preparations to reproduce itself, but it wasn't a queen either. At least some of them must be hermaphroditic, self-fertilizing, so that even one isolated individual can perpetuate the species. A warrior worker is capable of producing eggs, but only slowly, one at a time, until it can develop a queen to take over the job." Ripley goes on to add, "At least that's the best scenario I can come up with. I'm no xenologist."
Another xenomorph scene that was not filmed and was removed was going to be a scene where the crew stumbles upon the xenomorph that's breaking into their food locker and it's actually eating their food. Then upon being caught, it runs into the air duct, and this leads directly into the scene of Dallas with the flamethrower in the air shaft. This also would have been an interesting take for the xenomorphs, as far as the movies go, we have not really seen them eating before. There is a brief shot in Alien 3 where it looks like the Xenomorph is eating someone, but that alien was birthed from a dog, and the Xenomorphs are said to retain 40% of the DNA of their host. So that type of feeding could have just been more from the dog side of him than the Xeno side of him. So it's been widely speculated on what the Xenomorphs actually eat, or do they even need to eat at all. Some have suggested that maybe they eat similar to a fly.
It's been theorized that the inner jaw of the Xenomorph, other than its use for attack purposes, may actually function in a way similar to a fly, where the insect's proboscis emits its own acidic stomach contents onto their potential meal, breaking it down into a liquid form and consuming it through the proboscis. Considering the xenomorph life cycle bears quite a few similarities to insects, in particular a comparison is often made to the African tsetse fly, it wouldn't be unreasonable to arrive at this conclusion when it comes to their eating habits.
Another theory is that because the xenomorphs only have a very short lifespan, they, similar to like ants or bees, might just only eat the amount of food they need just to keep them going because they just work all the time, basically. In which case, their trademark double mouth shot that they use to kill people would get them just one mouthful of flesh each time they kill someone. Maybe that's all they need to just keep going until their life cycle runs out. Either way, it's something interesting to think about. The moment towards the end where Ripley is in the shuttle and the xenomorph swipes at her is a moment where we see a much more subdued alien than we have throughout the rest of the movie. Some believe this is because the xenomorph is slowly dying because he's reached the end of his life cycle. I happen to believe it's because he was going into hibernation because he figured he'd be floating out of space for a while, so he was just going to sleep and he couldn't shut that process down once it had started. So that's why he's kind of more groggy. I think this because after he sees Ripley and she's hiding in the closet putting on the spacesuit, he does still extend his second jaw trying to get at her. He just doesn't seem to have the energy to walk over there and do it just yet. This implies to me that if he was more energetic, he definitely would, but he's going into hibernation, so he doesn't. He doesn't even move out from there until he's hit with those air jets. So as you can see, the xenomorph is quite different in this than he later becomes in the other movies. So is the space jockey, for that matter.
Looks like it's grown out of the chair.
Grown out of the chair? No. He's just sat in it.
Bones have been outward. Like he exploded from inside.
Oh, those aren't bones. That's just a suit. It's actually just a guy in a suit. Yeah, one of those questions I hope that they answer in Prometheus 2 is whether or not anyone bothered to remember to watch Alien to make sure they weren't fucking everything up in Prometheus.
Way to go, Prometheus! You dropped the ball yet again. By the way, I highly recommend you check out this guy's channel. His name is Decker. He does really good nostalgia critic style reviews. I'll put a card in the top right corner here. As with all movies, Alien went through a number of rewrites. The most significant rewrite added a number of different elements, such as the whole idea of the truckers in space kind of thing, and also Ash himself. The whole idea of an android that's a sleeper cell in the crew who's tasked with bringing the xenomorph back to Earth to be researched. All of that was included, and it adds a whole nother level to the movie. It's one of those things that when you go back and watch the movie again, you notice lots of weird little things that Ash does that you don't notice the first time round, such as this. I like the way he kind of just checks to see if anyone's around first, and then he does his run. I think it's some kind of like system diagnosis to make sure everything's working. But the moment in which he actually attacks Ripley, I thought was kind of one of the freakiest moments of the whole movie. Because when you watch this back knowing that he's an android, you can notice that he's kind of glitching out. Like the fact that he's sweating this milk blood that these androids have, and the weird facial expressions that he makes, at least to me, indicates that there's like a conflict going on inside him. He's obviously been programmed to do whatever he needs to do in order to get the alien specimen back, but as an android, of course, he would have been programmed with stuff in there not to hurt humans. So this weird kind of spaz out stuff that he does, I think it's because there's still some kind kind of conflict in there in his system. And what he says later on about how he admires the Xenomorph explains why he kind of imitates the facehugger in the way he goes about trying to dispatch of Ripley. He rolls up the magazine and shoves it in her throat in the same way the facehugger does, and then when Peters tries to pull him off, he makes a little claw with his hand and claws him on the chest in the same way the facehugger does. And of course, Ridley Scott, being the weirdo that he is, had his own theories about this.
And I always thought that was interesting, that do humanoids have sexual urges? You know, what would be nice is that this is the closest he ever gets to a sexual relationship.
You're sick! You're sick! Why would you do that to me? I'm just kidding you, pal.
In the expanded universe, a story called Alien Out of the Shadows actually continues Ash's story. He doesn't die when he gets flamethrowered here. Turns out he actually succeeded in uploading part of his consciousness to the escape shuttle. So when Ripley is floating off safely, part of Ash's mind is in the ship that's around her. In the expanded universe story, it goes on to explain this is actually part of the reason why, as we find out later in Aliens, that she's drifting in space for 57 years. That was Ash making sure that happens. He didn't want to go back to Earth because he still had his programming of wanting to find a Xenomorph and to bring it back. So he was keeping her out there in order to try and do that. Throughout the Out of the Shadows story, he does eventually get killed by a computer virus wiping him out of the system. But throughout that story, it also shows that in the same way he admires the Xenomorph, he also admires Ripley for her tenacity and her toughness and her survival instincts. I've mentioned in some of the other videos, I always find it interesting the relationship between the synthetics in this franchise and the aliens. Sometimes they get taken out as a threat, other times they could just walk on past and the aliens will ignore them. It does make me wonder though, if Weyland-Yutani wants these Xenomorphs so much, why don't they just send an entire crew of synthetics out to get them? Wouldn't that make it easier than Ash having to deceive all these people? In fact, why doesn't Weyland-Yutani just have all synthetics as their crew members? Not only would they not have to pay them, they wouldn't have to worry about putting air in the ships or food in the ships or anything really. They'd work pretty much round the clock. Seems like something you might want to look into, Weyland-Yutani. Ripley's character was originally wrote to be a man. In fact, the entire cast was all going to be men. And when the decision was made to change the main character to a female lead, needless to say, in this kind of movie, that was very rare.
So Laddie said was one day, can Ripley be a woman? And we looked at each other, we said, yeah, but it seems kind of funny. I mean, they've never done that, a woman in a space horror movie as the leading character. And he said, well, I have a feeling that's going to make it unique. They screen tested many people, but she was dynamite. You saw it right there in the screen test, as you saw later in the movie. This was her very first film. It's all behind the eyes.
My intuition, always in casting, is from the second they walk through the door. When I would see somebody walk through that door, I knew somehow this was her.
Personally, I think that if a movie wants to have a female heroine, Ripley is kind of the prototype of that. She's actually kind of gender neutral. The fact that she's a woman is pretty much incidental to her character and the story in general. And while you buy her as a leader for this group, she still maintains that femininity. I mean, there's a difference between having a female lead and having a female that is just the same as a man. And I think the Ripley character hits the nail right on the head in that regard. It's something I hope Wonder Woman can do as well. And this is another thing that all of us watching the movie now in hindsight, we all know Ripley is the main character. But for people who saw this for the first time, they thought Dallas was the main character. And a lot of the first half of the movie does sort of revolve around him. So when he dies, it's a really big shock. It's one of those moments where you know nobody's safe in this movie. And Ridley Scott really pushed her in order to get the very best performance that he possibly could out of her. In one deleted scene, where Lambert was supposed to slap Ripley after the death of Dallas because she blamed Ripley for it, Sigourney Weaver would roll with the slap, and they did it a couple of times, such as here.
Right, what the fuck is going on? Hey.
But Ridley Scott then decided that it wasn't realistic enough and just told the actress to hit her for real this time.
What the fuck is going on?
Hey!
Now that's a real fight, you could see the difference. This cut scene might also explain why Ripley has a blood nose before Ash attacks her. Ash hasn't actually laid a hand on her yet, so there's no reason why she should have a blood nose, unless it's a carryover from that scene which was cut. Or it could have also been from a different scene of Ripley that was cut, where after the death of Dallas, she has the idea to seal the entire ship off block by block until they corner it in one area of the ship, and then blast it out into space.
We'll move in pairs. We'll go step by step and cut off every bulkhead and every vent until we have it cornered, and then we'll blow it the fuck out into space. Is that acceptable to you?
In the deleted scene, they almost succeed in doing that when Ash sets off a fire alarm that triggers the Xenomorph to leave the area. In doing so, it gets partially injured and its blood eats through the hull of the ship and causes the room that Ripley is in to become depressurized, and blood starts coming out of her ears and her nose. She barely escapes. So this blood nose could be a carryover from that scene, which they also never ended up filming, but apparently the DLC for the video game Alien Isolation did include a version of this scene that never made it into the movie.
Must have been a glitch in the system. Nothing we could do.
But a lot of science nerds have pointed out that LV-426 in the movie is said to be the next star over from our star, which would make it Alpha Centauri, which, assuming that the Nostromo can travel at light speed, it would take them about 4 years to get from there back to Earth again, which explains why they would have the sleeping capsule things. But Dallas points out they're only half of the way home.
Some of you may have figured out we're not home yet. We're only halfway there.
Which means their original destination would have taken them 8 years to get there and another 8 years to get back. 16 years round trip. That's a big journey for them to take. This kind of creates a bit of a problem when in the next movie they introduce that she's got a kid. It's unlikely that someone who has a daughter would want to disappear for 16 years into space. And personally, I kind of like the idea that everyone who's on a ship like this, because it's going to be away for so long, these are people without real connections back home. It kind of fits with a lot of the character types you see on this ship. They're all a little bit antisocial, which, as you would imagine, you would need to be in order to disappear on a trip like this for such a long stint of time and not care about missing 16 years back on Earth. I also like the fact that the character of Ripley doesn't have a romance with the captain of the ship, Dallas. There's a little bit of a hinting that there's something going on there, but they're really just colleagues, they're really just friends. In the novelization, they definitely do have a relationship, and in early versions of the script there was supposed to be a love scene between the two of them, which would add extra tragedy when she finally mercy kills him. But I'm glad that was not included in the movie so that Ripley could just be Ripley. You know, every now and then you come across some kind of internet rabbit hole that you tumble down, and the next thing you know, it's 2:30 in the morning, you're researching some weird thing, and you're wondering, what the hell has happened to your life? Well, this topic was definitely one of those moments for me. Let us tumble down that rabbit hole together, shall we? The character of Lambert, the only other female member of the crew other than Sigourney Weaver, is Lambert, and Lambert is played by Veronica Cartwright, who was in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. She was a significant actress back then. But the manner in which she dies in Alien is a source of much weird debate on the internet. Let's just look at the facts of what we see in the movie. So her and Peter are trying to get some gear together to evacuate the ship, and the alien shows up. It kills Peter, and then it moves on Lambert. The movie then cuts away, and we just hear the sound going over the speakers because there's an open communications device of her screaming and then the sound going dead. However, when Ripley shows up at the scene, what she sees is Peter laying there dead and Lambert seemingly hanging from the roof, her feet dangling in front of the camera, and her shoes and pants have both been removed. Why, oh why, would that be the case? Many people have suggested that due to this rather unusual moment right before the alien moves on her, where his tail hooks up between her legs, that perhaps the alien intended to do something a little bit unorthodox with this woman, thus resulting in all the blood on her legs. Now, of course, the obvious question is, how could the Xenomorph even do what people are suggesting he would do to this woman, since they're kind of asexual. They don't really have genders, do they? Their reproduction cycle is completely different to humans. I mean, he could use his tail, I guess, but why? Why would he? But then you also got to consider that xenomorphs do retain 40% of the DNA from their host, so perhaps that 40% of the DNA, he has some concept of the human reproductive system and all that. But again, just why? Personally, I don't buy into any of this. Looking at all the behind the scenes stuff, it seems obvious that they just threw this scene together because the scene they were going to film for Lambert's death, they didn't end up doing, so they just slapped this together without really thinking much about it. Originally in the script, her death was going to be she runs off and hides in a locker, and when the xenomorph tracks her down with his advanced sensors, she literally dies of fright. She has a heart attack and dies out of fear. But it's in the novelization that I think we can kind of start to put together the idea here. In that, it's pointed out that the xenomorph gets into this room by dropping down through the air shaft. So after he takes out Peter, his idea is to take her alive back to where he's brewing up his eggs and his facehuggers so she can be a host for another xenomorph. So in doing so, he picks her up and he's trying to stuff her through this air vent to get her through there, which would explain why she's dangling from the roof, at which point I would say that she died of fright, as was the original plan in the story. Now being dead, the xenomorph has no use for her as serving as a host, so he just says, well, never mind, I'm going to take off, and he just leaves her dangling half out of the air vent. And I guess since he was trying to push her up into the air vent, then I guess her pants kind of ripped off with all this claws in the act of him doing that. Nothing weird going on. That's just what I believe happened. But then there's some other novelization of that same scene where it describes that part of what makes Peter rush towards the alien to attack it is because, quote, he sees what it's doing to her, which seems to suggest something else. So I don't know. It's, like I said, it's one of those crazy internet rabbit holes, but I'd be interested to know what you guys thought happened when you first saw that. So guys, our video for next week is going to be Spider-Man 3, because as I said, since both Alien Covenant and Spider-Man Homecoming are going to be released around May, we're going to be switching back and forth between those two franchises. And the next one on the Spider-Man list is Spider-Man 3. Whew, that's going to be fun. So this movie, just like its predecessor, Aliens, is another one of those movies that shows a director in his prime, doing his absolute best work when he's his youngest and at his most hungry. And I was not exaggerating when I said at the beginning of this video that it truly is a work of cinematic art, and if you have an interest in getting into film, it's a must-see. It was also interesting in the behind the scenes to hear Ridley Scott say this.
I'll only do another science fiction if I've got a really good script. So really, finally, it's about the story.
Yeah, sure you will, Ridley Scott. Sure you will. So I hope you enjoyed that, guys. If you want to check out any more videos from me, you can click on any of the ones you see right here. I am Bandit, this is Bandit Incorporated, and until next time, I will see you guys in the comments.